sister-in-law tried to turn my kids against me, then my daughter recorded everything. My sister-in-law Rachel babysat every Wednesday while I worked late. She'd spend the entire time poisoning my kids against me. Your mom doesn't really love you like I do. If she loved you, she wouldn't work so much. She'd tell my 8-year-old I was selfish for not buying the expensive toys she brought. I'd never deprive my children. Your mom cares more about money than happiness. She'd gather them for story time, tales about bad mothers who abandon children for work. Just like your situation. But Aunt Rachel will always be here. My kids started crying when I picked them up. Asked why I didn't love them like Aunt Rachel. My husband said I was paranoid. She's helping for free. Stop creating problems. When I suggested different childcare, Rachel would cry. You want to separate me from the children? They need stability. My husband would get angry at me for upsetting her. 8 months of my children pulling away while Rachel played perfect aunt. Showing up at school events I missed. Telling teachers she was basically raising them. Buying clothes, signing them up for activities without asking. Someone has to put these children first, she'd say. Everyone thought I was crazy for being uncomfortable. My husband called her generous. My mother-in-law said be grateful. Then my 12-year-old Daisy started acting strange. Watchful. Staring at Rachel during dinners. Refusing to stay at Rachel's but wouldn't say why. What I didn't know, Daisy had started recording Rachel's sessions on her tablet. Propping it behind pillows, letting it run during toxic rants. 3 weeks of recordings. Comments about me being terrible. Lies about not wanting more children because I'm selfish. Rachel saying she wished she was their real mother. The worst. Rachel telling my son I was sending him to boarding school because he was too much trouble. He cried for hours while she held him, saying, I'd never send you away. Daisy waited until Thanksgiving dinner. Entire family there. Rachel mid-performance about being such an important part of the children's lives. It's not easy stepping up when a parent can't be present, but someone has to put the children's emotional needs first. Daisy stood up. Aunt Rachel, can you explain what you meant when you told us Mom doesn't really love us? Silence. Rachel laughed nervously. I'd never say that. You're confused. Daisy pulled out her tablet. That's weird because I have recordings. Want me to play them? Rachel went pale. You recorded without permission? That's inappropriate. My husband asked to hear them. Daisy played everything. Every toxic comment. Every lie. Every manipulation. Dead silence except Rachel's voice from the tablet, saying horrible things about me. My mother-in-law stood. You told my grandchildren their mother would abandon them? I was preparing them emotionally in case... In case what? My husband's voice was ice. In case she did what you're doing? Emotional abandonment? Manipulation? Daisy spoke again. She also said if anything happened to Mom, she'd convince Dad to let her raise us. My husband banned Rachel immediately. From seeing the children. From family events. Everything. Her husband divorced her within a year. She lost everything trying to steal my family. Now she posts about family importance and strong female role models on Facebook. People ask why she never sees her nieces and nephews. She never answers. But last week, everything changed. Daisy came to me crying. Mom, there's more recordings I didn't play. What do you mean? Aunt Rachel wasn't just talking about you. She played a recording from 2 days before Thanksgiving. Rachel's voice, but talking to someone on the phone. The pills are working. She's getting sicker. A few more weeks and she'll be too weak to fight for custody. My blood went cold. Pills? Another recording. I've been putting them in her coffee every Wednesday. She thinks it's stress making her tired. I'd been exhausted for months. Dizzy. Weak. Doctor said it was work stress. She said once you were too sick, she'd convince Dad you couldn't care for us. Daisy whispered. Another recording. The husband already trusts me more than her. When she has her breakdown, I'll be there to pick up the pieces. Daisy? When did she say this? The recordings aren't from last year, Mom. I kept recording after Thanksgiving. She's been coming to the house. That's impossible. She's banned. Dad lets her in when you're at work. Says you're being too harsh. Says family deserves second chances. I grabbed my phone to call my husband. It went straight to voicemail. Daisy pulled up another recording. From yesterday. My husband's voice. The papers are ready? Rachel. Custody papers. Once she's declared unfit, you'll get everything. And we can finally be together. Like we should have been from the start. Daisy looked at me. Mom, I recorded them kissing. My phone buzzed. Text from husband. Working late. Rachel offered to watch kids. See you tomorrow. But I was staring at our security app. My husband's car in the driveway. Rachel's too. They were both home. I grabbed Daisy and pulled up the security app on my phone. The live feed showed both cars sitting in my driveway. My hands shook so bad I almost dropped the device. Daisy leaned close and whispered that she had 3 more recordings from this week that I hadn't heard yet. Her face looked scared, but also determined in a way that made my chest hurt. I told Daisy to pack a bag for herself and her brother right now. I kept my voice quiet and normal. We moved through the house like we were just getting ready for bed. I grabbed important documents from my desk drawer while Daisy slipped her tablet into her backpack. Birth certificates went in first, then passports, then the folder with all our insurance papers. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, but I kept moving. Daisy woke her brother gently and helped him put clothes in his backpack. He was too sleepy to ask questions. I texted my husband that I was taking the kids to my sister's house because I was feeling sick again. He'd buy it since I'd been sick for months, according to everyone. His response came back in seconds, saying Rachel could come check on me. My stomach turned over hard. Now I knew exactly what they'd been doing all this time. Every Wednesday when she supposedly helped. Every time he defended her. Every moment I thought I was going crazy. We were in the car within 15 minutes. I drove to a hotel 3 towns over instead of my sister's house. Daisy sat in the back with her sleeping brother. She told me there were recordings of them talking about getting me committed to a psychiatric facility. Her voice was small and scared. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. The road blurred in front of me, but I kept driving. At the hotel, I finally listened to the new recordings while the kids slept in the other bed. Rachel's voice came through the tablet speaker talking about how the medication adjustments were making me more confused. My husband laughed about how I actually believed the doctor when he said it was just stress. They sounded so casual about it, like they were discussing what to have for dinner instead of slowly killing me. I had to run to the bathroom and throw up. When I came back, Daisy was awake watching me with worried eyes. I didn't sleep at all that night. Instead, I made lists of everything I needed to do and everyone I needed to call. By morning, I had a plan written on hotel notepaper. The first call I made was to a lawyer whose card I got from a friend 2 years ago. I'd kept it in my wallet for some reason. Now I knew why. Marshall Booth agreed to see me that same morning. I brought Daisy with me because she had the evidence. We sat in his office while he listened to 3 recordings before stopping me. His face got harder with each word from the tablet. He said what they'd done wasn't just divorce material. It was criminal. He used words like attempted murder and conspiracy. I felt cold all over hearing him say those things out loud. Marshall explained that poisoning was attempted murder and conspiracy to commit fraud. He could think of about 6 other charges immediately. He made calls while I sat in his office trying to breathe normally. Within 2 hours, I had appointments with a detective and a doctor and a child protective services investigator. Everything was happening so fast. Marshall kept talking on the phone using legal words I barely understood. Daisy held my hand the whole time. The detective Amira Pugh met me at the hospital where they took blood samples and hair samples for testing. She'd handled domestic violence cases before. She told me that what Rachel did with the recordings of her own crimes was the stupidest criminal behavior she'd seen in years. Criminals usually tried to hide evidence, not create detailed audio documentation of their plans. She almost smiled when she said it, but her eyes stayed serious. The doctor examined me and wrote down every symptom I'd had for months. The exhaustion and dizziness and digestive problems and confusion. He said the symptom pattern was the same as several types of poisoning. We'd know more when the test results came back in a few days. He took so many vials of blood I got dizzy watching. Daisy sat next to me holding my other hand while the nurse worked. The doctor kept shaking his head and making notes. He said I was lucky my daughter was so smart and brave. I looked at Daisy and started crying right there in the exam room. Same story with Ian. He listened to everything and wrote notes without interrupting. He interviewed my son separately and asked him about what Rachel said about boarding school. My son told him the same story he told me, crying the whole time. Ian said the emotional damage was clear, and he'd recommend supervised visits only with my husband until further evaluation. He said Rachel shouldn't be allowed near the children at all given what she'd done. Marshall called that evening with an update on the emergency custody hearing scheduled for 2 weeks out. He said we had enough evidence to win, but more kept appearing every day. The judge would review everything including Daisy's recordings and the medical reports and Ian's recommendations. I asked what happened if we lost, and he said we wouldn't lose with this much documentation. His confidence helped, but I still couldn't sleep. Daisy and I went through the house room by room the next day, looking for anything else Rachel might have left behind. We checked drawers and closets and cabinets. In my bedroom, Daisy found a small black device stuck to the back of my dresser. It had a tiny camera lens pointing at the bed. I felt sick looking at it. Rachel had been watching me in my own bedroom, recording me sleeping or getting dressed or being vulnerable. Daisy took photos of it before we touched it, and then I called Amira. She came over within an hour and collected the camera in an evidence bag. She said they were building a case that got stronger every single day. Every piece of evidence made it harder for Rachel to claim anything was accidental or misunderstood. The camera proved this was planned and invasive and meant to violate my privacy while gathering information to use against me. My son broke down crying that night, asking if Daddy was coming home and why Aunt Rachel got arrested. He didn't understand what happened or why everything changed so fast. I sat with him on his bed trying to find words an 8-year-old could understand. I told him that Daddy and Aunt Rachel did very bad things to hurt Mommy. They gave me medicine that made me sick, and they lied about lots of things. They wanted to take him and Daisy away from me even though I loved them more than anything. He sobbed into my shirt asking if it was his fault. I held him tight and promised him over and over that none of this was his fault. Adults made bad choices, and now they had to face consequences for those choices. He asked if Daddy stopped loving us, and I said I didn't know, but I knew for sure that I would never stop loving him and Daisy. He fell asleep in my arms, and I carried him back to his bed. Daisy showed me more recordings the next morning that I hadn't heard yet. Rachel talking to someone on the phone about draining my bank account slowly so I wouldn't notice. She laughed about how easy it was to access the joint account and move small amounts every week. The person on the other end asked if I'd caught on, and Rachel said no, because I trusted my husband completely. She said by the time I figured it out, they'd have enough money hidden away to disappear if they needed to. I felt rage burning in my chest listening to her casual voice discussing stealing from me. I called Marshall immediately, and he said he'd file for emergency freezing of all joint accounts and credit cards within the hour. He also said we needed to hire a forensic accountant to trace where the money went. The forensic accountant Marshall hired found transfers going back 6 months. Rachel had been moving money from our joint account to offshore accounts in small amounts that looked like normal expenses. She'd taken over $40,000 total while poisoning me and planning to take my children. The accountant showed me spreadsheets with dates and amounts and account numbers. Every transfer happened on a Wednesday when Rachel was supposedly babysitting. She'd been stealing from us the whole time she pretended to help. Marshall said this added fraud and theft charges to everything else. The prosecutor would love having financial crimes to stack on top of the attempted murder and conspiracy charges. I started seeing a therapist because I couldn't sleep more than 2 hours at a time, and I kept checking everything I ate or drank multiple times. Even water from the tap made me nervous. I'd inspect my coffee cup before using it and smell everything before putting it in my mouth. The therapist said I had PTSD from the poisoning and betrayal. She explained that my brain was trying to protect me by staying alert for danger, but it was exhausting my body. She said it would take time to feel safe again. Maybe months or years. I'd need to relearn trust, and that wouldn't happen overnight. She gave me exercises for managing anxiety and panic attacks. I practiced them every night, but still woke up checking the locks on all the doors. Rachel's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal according to Marshall. They wanted reduced charges in exchange for Rachel pleading guilty and avoiding trial. Marshall called Devin the prosecutor to discuss it, and Devin said absolutely not with this much evidence and premeditation. He wanted to take it to trial and make an example of how seriously the state takes domestic poisoning cases. He said too many people got away with poisoning family members because it was hard to prove. This case had recordings and medical evidence and financial records. He planned to use it to show that poisoning wouldn't be tolerated and would result in serious prison time. Marshall agreed and told Rachel's lawyer there would be no deals. My husband's lawyer contacted Marshall the following week asking about reconciliation and dropping charges, like I would ever consider taking him back after what he did. Marshall's response was so coldly professional that even I was impressed when he read it to me over the phone. He told them my client has no interest in reconciliation with someone who conspired to poison her and steal her children. The criminal charges are being pursued by the state, not by my client, so there's nothing to drop. We'll see you in court. My husband's lawyer tried to argue that marriages could be saved and families needed to stay together. Marshall said not when one spouse tries to murder the other one. He hung up on them. I discovered Rachel had been forging my signature on the school permission slips and medical forms for months. The school secretary called asking about a field trip form that looked different from my usual signature. I went to the school and asked to see all the forms from the past year. At least 15 had signatures that didn't match my actual writing. Rachel had been signing my name on everything from field trip permissions to medication authorization forms. The school made copies for me and I gave them to Marshall. It was more evidence of how she was systematically replacing me, taking over every aspect of my children's lives while I worked, and making herself look like the responsible parent. The school apologized for not catching it sooner. Ian from CPS filed his report supporting my custody case. Marshall got a copy and read parts of it to me over the phone. It stated that Daisy's recordings showed clear evidence of parental alienation and emotional abuse. Rachel had deliberately undermined my relationship with my children and caused them psychological harm. Ian recommended supervised visitation only for my husband and no contact at all with Rachel. He said my husband had enabled the abuse by allowing Rachel access after she was banned and by participating in the poisoning conspiracy. The children needed protection from both of them, until it could be proven they weren't a danger. Marshall said this report basically guaranteed I'd get sole custody at the hearing. My son started having nightmares about being sent away to boarding school. He'd wake up screaming that he didn't want to go and begging me not to send him away. I'd hold him while he cried and promise him over and over that he was staying with me and Daisy forever. I told him Aunt Rachel lied about the boarding school to scare him. There was never any boarding school plan. I would never send him away because I loved him and wanted him with me always. He asked me to promise at least 10 times every night. I promised every single time and meant it with my whole heart. Eventually, he'd fall back asleep, but I'd stay awake watching him breathe and feeling angry that Rachel had planted this fear in his mind. The courtroom felt too small and too cold at the same time. I sat next to Marshall at the front table while my husband sat across the aisle with his lawyer. 2 weeks had passed since everything exploded, and now a judge was going to decide who got to keep my children. The judge was a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back tight. She looked tired but alert. Marshall had submitted Daisy's recordings as evidence, and the judge said she wanted to listen to them herself before making any decisions. We sat there for over an hour while she played them through headphones, her face getting harder with each passing minute. My husband kept his eyes on the table in front of him. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days, his shirt wrinkled and his tie crooked. I watched him and felt nothing but cold anger burning in my chest. This man had tried to kill me. This man had helped Rachel poison me for months while pretending to care. The judge finally took off her headphones and set them down. She looked at my husband for a long moment before speaking. Marshall squeezed my hand under the table. The judge granted me temporary sole custody of both children. My husband could have supervised visitation only, 1 hour per week at a monitored facility where a social worker would be present the entire time. His lawyer stood up immediately and started arguing that it was too harsh. He said families needed time together, and that my husband deserved a chance to rebuild trust with his children. The judge cut him off mid-sentence. She said that when someone conspires to poison the mother of their children, extreme caution is warranted. She said my husband had enabled abuse and participated in a plot to steal custody through illegal means. 1 hour per week under supervision was generous given the circumstances. My husband's lawyer sat back down without another word. My phone rang 3 days later while I was making dinner. It was my sister calling. She sounded annoyed and tired when I answered. My mother-in-law had been calling her nonstop for 2 days, leaving long voicemails about how I was destroying the family. The messages said Rachel had made mistakes but didn't deserve prison. They said I was being vindictive and cruel by pressing charges. My sister told her to stop calling or she would get her own restraining order against her. I thanked my sister for having my back and apologized for dragging her into this mess. She said not to worry about it, that she was happy to tell my mother-in-law exactly where she could shove her opinions. After we hung up, I deleted another voicemail from my mother-in-law that had come to my phone. I didn't even listen to it. Daisy went back to the school the following Monday. I drove her there myself and walked her to the front office to make sure all the safety protocols were still in place. The principal assured me that only I could authorize pickup and that Daisy's teachers had been briefed on the situation. Daisy seemed okay that morning, hugging me goodbye and heading to her classroom with her backpack. But 3 days later, her English teacher called me at work. She said Daisy was having trouble concentrating in class. She would stare out the window for long periods or start crying for no apparent reason. The teacher said Daisy seemed anxious and withdrawn, nothing like her usual self. I left work early and picked Daisy up from the school. We sat in the car in the parking lot while she cried into my shoulder. She kept saying she was sorry for not telling me about the recording sooner. I held her tight and told her she had nothing to be sorry for, that she saved our entire family. That night I called my therapist and asked if she could see Daisy too. She said she had an opening the next afternoon, and that it would be good for Daisy to have someone to talk to besides me. Daisy needed help processing everything she had witnessed and recorded. She needed someone who could help her understand that none of this was her fault. Amira called me 2 days after Daisy's first therapy session. She said they had searched Rachel's apartment as part of the investigation. They found a journal hidden in a box under Rachel's bed. The journal detailed the poisoning plan going back almost a year. Rachel had written about dosage amounts like she was conducting a science experiment. She tracked my symptoms week by week, noting when I seemed more tired or confused. She wrote about adjusting the amounts based on how sick I appeared. Amira said it was some of the most disturbing evidence she had ever seen in a domestic case. The level of planning and the cold calculation in those journal entries showed that Rachel knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't an accident or a moment of passion. This was attempted murder carried out slowly and deliberately over months. Amira sent Marshall a copy of the journal entries the next day. He called me that evening and read parts of it out loud over the phone. The journal revealed that Rachel and my husband had started their affair 2 years ago, long before she started babysitting my children. Everything had been planned from the beginning. The poisoning, the custody grab, even which offshore accounts they would use to hide money. Rachel had written about how they needed to be patient and careful. She wrote about slowly turning my children against me while making herself look like the better parent. She wrote about the exact timeline for when I would be too sick to fight back. The journal showed that my husband had been lying to me for years, that our entire life together had been built on his betrayal. Marshall said this evidence made the criminal case against Rachel even stronger. It also gave us more ammunition for the divorce proceedings. Marshall filed for divorce on my behalf the following week. The grounds were adultery, conspiracy, and attempted murder. He said we had more than enough evidence to prove all three. My husband didn't contest the filing. His lawyer called Marshall 2 days later and said my husband was willing to give me everything just to avoid harsher criminal charges. He would sign over the house, the cars, and most of our shared assets. He wouldn't fight for custody beyond the supervised visitation the judge had already ordered. Marshall said it was the fastest capitulation he had ever seen in a divorce case. My husband knew he had no defense and no leverage. He was just trying to minimize the damage at this point. I learned something new about my husband the next week that broke me in a way I didn't expect. Marshall got records from Rachel's family as part of the discovery process. The records showed that Rachel and my husband had been engaged before he met me. They were planning a wedding when Rachel decided to break it off to pursue her career. She moved to another city for a job and my husband stayed here. He met me 6 months later. I had always thought I was his first serious relationship, his first real love. Now I found out I was his second choice. Rachel had been the one he wanted, and when she left, he settled for me. Then years later, after seeing him with our family, Rachel decided she wanted him back. She wanted the life she had given up. My entire marriage was apparently built on lies. I sat in Marshall's office staring at the engagement photos from 8 years ago. Rachel in a white dress, my husband smiling at her the way he used to smile at me. I told my therapist about the engagement at our next session. She listened while I talked about feeling like my whole life had been fake. Every memory I had with my husband was now tainted by the knowledge that he had always loved someone else. That I was never his first choice. That our children were born from a relationship he settled for. The therapist said this was a grief process. I was mourning the relationship I thought I had versus the reality of what it was. She said it was normal to feel like everything was a lie, but that my feelings during the marriage had been real even if his were complicated. She said I needed to separate my truth from his deception. My love had been genuine. My commitment had been real. His betrayal didn't erase the validity of my own experience. My son asked me a question 2 nights later that I wasn't ready to answer. We were sitting on his bed reading a story before sleep when he looked up at me with his big eyes. He asked if Daddy ever loved us. He said if Daddy loved us, he wouldn't have done bad things with Rachel. I had to choose between being honest and being kind. I thought about all the ways I could answer that question. I could tell him the truth, that I didn't know if his father was capable of real love. I could tell him that his father had been using us as substitutes for the life he really wanted. But my son was 8 years old, and he needed to believe that someone loved him. So I told him that Daddy made very bad choices, but that didn't mean he never loved him. I said people could love someone and still hurt them through their actions. I said Daddy's choices were about Daddy's problems, not about my son's worth. My son asked if I was sure. I promised him I was sure, even though I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. 3 weeks later, Marshall called to tell me Rachel's trial date was set. 2 months out, which felt like forever, but also not enough time. I sat in his office while he explained the timeline, showing me a calendar with dates marked in red. Devin would be handling the prosecution, and Marshall said the case was strong. The recordings, the journal, the toxicology reports, the financial records showing the stolen money, everything pointed to guilt on multiple counts. Devin was confident about conviction, and Marshall said he'd seen weaker cases send people away for decades. I wanted to feel relief, but mostly I felt tired, like I'd been running for months and still couldn't stop. My husband's lawyer contacted Marshall the next week about a plea deal. He wanted to testify against Rachel in exchange for reduced charges. Instead of prison time, he'd get probation and mandatory therapy. Marshall explained it to me over the phone while I sat in my car outside the grocery store, gripping the steering wheel. He said it was probably the best outcome because it guaranteed Rachel would go away for a long time. My husband's testimony would seal her fate. I said yes because I wanted Rachel in prison more than I wanted revenge on him. Maybe that made me weak, but I was tired of fighting and this felt like the path to safety for my kids. Marshall filed the paperwork and told me the deal was solid. 2 days before Rachel's trial was supposed to start, my phone rang at 6 in the morning. Marshall's voice was tight with anger when I answered. My husband had tried to have me committed to a psychiatric facility. He'd contacted the marriage counselor we saw months ago, before everything came out, and tried to convince her I was having a mental breakdown. He wanted her to sign papers saying I was a danger to myself and the kids. The counselor refused and called Amira instead, reporting the whole thing as witness tampering. Now there were additional charges against my husband for trying to interfere with the case. Marshall said the plea deal was violated and everything was falling apart. I sat on my kitchen floor listening to him explain that my husband had destroyed his own chance at leniency. His lawyer was calling it a terrible mistake, and Devin was furious about the commitment attempt. New charges were being filed for obstruction of justice. My husband would face trial too now, standing beside Rachel instead of testifying against her. Marshall's voice softened when he told me this actually helped our case because it showed the conspiracy was ongoing, that my husband was still trying to manipulate the system even after being caught. I hung up and threw up in the sink because I couldn't believe he'd tried to have me locked away. After everything, he was still trying to make me disappear. Daisy had to testify at Rachel's trial. The thought of putting her through that made me sick, but she insisted she wanted to do it. She sat in Devin's office for hours, practicing how to answer questions and stay calm under cross-examination. He taught her to pause before answering, to speak clearly, to look at the jury when she talked. She practiced saying the worst parts of the recordings out loud, her voice steady even when mine would have broken. Devin told her she was the bravest kid he'd ever worked with, and she smiled, but I could see the fear in her eyes. At night, she'd crawl into my bed like she used to when she was little, and I'd hold her while she slept. I wanted to tell her she didn't have to do this, that I'd find another way, but there was no other way. The recordings were the center of the case, and Daisy was the only one who could explain why she made them and what she heard. The trial started on a Monday morning in October. The courtroom was packed with people who'd heard about the case through local news coverage. I sat in the front row with Marshall on one side, an empty space on the other, where my family should have been. Devin stood at the prosecutor's table organizing papers while Rachel sat across the room in a gray suit that made her look professional and innocent. My husband sat at a different table with his own lawyer, separated from Rachel but still part of the same nightmare. The judge came in and everyone stood, and then we were sitting again, and Devin was giving his opening statement. He laid out the timeline of Rachel's systematic destruction of my life, starting with the parental alienation and ending with the poisoning. He showed the jury photos of me from 8 months ago looking healthy, then photos from right before Daisy revealed the recordings where I looked like I was dying. The difference was shocking even to me. He talked about the recordings, the journal, the financial theft, the custody conspiracy. He built the case piece by piece while Rachel sat perfectly still, her face blank. When he finished, Rachel's lawyer stood up and tried to paint her as a concerned aunt who made mistakes but never meant real harm. The jury looked skeptical. Daisy took the stand on day 3. She wore the blue dress we'd picked out together and her hair was pulled back in a ponytail. Devin asked her to explain why she started recording Rachel, and Daisy's voice was clear and strong. She said Rachel made her feel uncomfortable, that the things she said about me didn't match what Daisy knew to be true. She said she started recording to prove she wasn't making it up, that Rachel really was saying terrible things. Devin played clips of the recordings while Daisy sat there listening to Rachel's voice poison the air. Then he asked Daisy to explain what she heard in each recording, and she did. She talked about Rachel saying I didn't love them, about the boarding school lie, about the poisoning conversations. Rachel's lawyer tried to shake her testimony during cross-examination, asking if Daisy might have misunderstood what she heard or taken things out of context. Daisy looked right at the lawyer and said no, she understood perfectly. She'd listened to the recordings dozens of times to make sure. The lawyer tried again, suggesting Daisy had been coached by me to lie. Daisy's face went hard, and she said nobody told her what to say. that she was telling the truth because someone needed to protect her mom. I sat in that courtroom watching my 12-year-old daughter refuse to budge under pressure, and I'd never been more proud. Natasha Ellis took the stand the next day, the toxicologist who'd analyzed my blood and hair samples. She brought charts showing my declining health over 8 months, with measurements of antifreeze levels in my system at different points. The charts showed a steady increase in poison concentration, proving the exposure was ongoing and intentional. She explained how antifreeze poisoning works, how it damages kidneys and causes the exact symptoms I'd experienced. Then she showed projections of what would have happened if Daisy hadn't discovered the truth. Another 3 months and my kidneys would have failed. 6 months and I'd probably be dead. Several jury members looked horrified at the visual representation of slow murder laid out in colored graphs and medical terminology. Natasha's voice stayed professional and calm while she described my near-death in clinical terms, but her eyes kept finding mine across the courtroom. During cross-examination, Rachel's lawyer tried to suggest the antifreeze could have come from somewhere else, that maybe I'd been exposed at work or through contaminated water. Natasha shut that down immediately, explaining that the levels and pattern of exposure were consistent only with deliberate, repeated dosing. She said there was no other explanation that fit the medical evidence. Rachel took the stand in her own defense on day 6. Her lawyer had advised against it according to the whispers I heard during breaks, but Rachel insisted. She wore white, which felt like a calculated choice, and her voice was soft and sad when she started talking. She claimed she'd been trying to help me by giving me supplements she thought would boost my energy. The supplements must have been contaminated somehow, she said, because she never meant to hurt me. She cried while she talked about how much she loved my children and how devastating it was to be accused of something so horrible. Devin let her talk herself into a corner during cross-examination. He pulled out the journal and read entries describing exact dosages and timing of the poison. He asked how supplements could be contaminated with antifreeze in such precise amounts. He showed her the recordings where she talked about making me sicker, about planning my breakdown. Rachel's story fell apart sentence by sentence. She started contradicting herself, saying she couldn't remember writing certain journal entries, then saying maybe she'd been confused. Devin asked if she was confused when she kissed my husband while planning to steal my children. Rachel's face went red and she said that was taken out of context. Devin played the recording of them discussing custody papers and being together. Rachel had no answer. The jury got the case after closing arguments on day 8. They deliberated for 6 hours while I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom unable to eat or think. Marshall brought me coffee I didn't drink. Daisy sat beside me doing homework like this was normal, like we weren't waiting to find out if the woman who tried to kill me would face consequences. My son was with my sister, protected from seeing this final piece of the nightmare. When the bailiff called us back in, my legs barely worked. The jury forewoman stood and read the verdicts one by one. Guilty on attempted murder, guilty on conspiracy, guilty on fraud, guilty on identity theft, guilty on child endangerment. Every count came back guilty and Rachel's face went white. Then she started screaming that I'd poisoned myself for attention, that this whole thing was my manipulation, that everyone was believing lies. The judge ordered her removed from the courtroom and 2 bailiffs grabbed her arms. She fought them while screaming. Her perfect mask finally shattered into something ugly and desperate. They dragged her out, still yelling, and the courtroom went quiet. Marshall squeezed my hand. Daisy leaned against my shoulder. The judge thanked the jury and set sentencing for 2 weeks out. We walked out of that courthouse into October sunshine, and I could finally breathe. Sentencing came 2 weeks after the verdict, and I sat in the same courtroom watching Rachel stand before the judge in an orange jumpsuit instead of the white dress she wore during trial. The judge read through each count methodically, pausing between them like he wanted every word to sink in. 18 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 12 years. The words hung in the air while Rachel stared straight ahead, her face blank now that the cameras were gone. The judge leaned forward and called her actions calculated, cruel, and a violation of family trust that endangered children. He said he'd seen many cases in his 30 years on the bench, but few showed such deliberate planning to destroy another person while manipulating innocent children. Rachel's lawyer tried to argue for leniency based on mental health considerations, but the judge shut that down immediately by pointing to the journal entries that showed clear awareness of right and wrong. Marshall squeezed my hand when the bailiffs led Rachel away, and this time she didn't scream or fight, just walked out like she'd already left her body behind. My husband's trial started 3 weeks later and lasted only 4 days because without Rachel to testify for him, his defense had nothing solid to stand on. His lawyer tried arguing he didn't know about the poisoning, but Devin played recordings where my husband discussed my declining health with Rachel, and never once suggested getting me proper medical help. The jury heard him talk about custody papers and being together, heard him dismiss my concerns about feeling sick, heard him let Rachel into our house after I banned her. They convicted him of conspiracy and accessory charges after deliberating for just 2 hours. 8 years with possibility of parole in 5, and he cried when the verdict came back, looking at me across the courtroom like he wanted me to feel sorry for him. I looked away and focused on Daisy sitting beside me, her hand gripping mine so tight my fingers went numb. The divorce got finalized while he sat in county jail awaiting transfer to state prison, and Marshall handled everything so I barely had to think about it. Full custody of both children, the house, most of our assets including retirement accounts, and the college funds Rachel had tried to drain. Marshall told me later it was the most one-sided settlement he'd seen in 20 years of family law, but given the circumstances, My husband's lawyer advised him not to fight anything. Fighting would mean more time in court, more evidence presented, more chances for additional charges to get filed. My husband signed everything without protest, and just like that, 15 years of marriage ended with a stack of papers and a judge's signature. 3 months after everything started, I finally slept through the whole night without checking the locks 5 times before bed. I woke up at 7 instead of 3 in the morning. Sunlight coming through curtains I'd replaced because the old ones reminded me of when Rachel used to visit. The therapist said I was making real progress in our session that afternoon, but she also warned me that PTSD recovery isn't a straight line going up. Some days would feel worse than others even months or years later, and I needed to be patient with myself when the bad days came. I nodded and believed her because I'd already noticed the pattern myself. How some mornings I felt almost normal, and other mornings I couldn't stop checking Daisy's tablet to make sure the recordings were still saved. My son started opening up more in his therapy sessions, finally talking about how confused he felt when Rachel said bad things about me, but then acted so nice to him. His therapist called me after one session to say he was processing the manipulation remarkably well for an 8-year-old, and with continued support he should recover without lasting damage to his ability to trust people. She said his resilience came partly from having Daisy as a protective older sister, and partly from seeing me fight back instead of giving up. I cried in my car after that phone call. Not sad tears, but something else I couldn't quite name. Maybe relief that my children might actually be okay someday. Daisy got recognized by the district attorney's office 6 weeks after Rachel's sentencing, receiving a Citizen's Award for bravery in gathering evidence and testifying. The ceremony happened in a conference room at the courthouse with Devin and Amira, and about 20 other people I didn't know. Daisy wore the blue dress she'd picked out herself, and stood at a podium that was too tall for her, speaking into a microphone about trusting your instincts when something feels wrong. She said if she'd ignored that feeling in her stomach when Rachel talked, her mom might not be here today. Her voice only shook once during the whole speech, and when she finished, everyone stood up and clapped while I tried not to sob in the front row. My mother-in-law reached out through Marshall about a month later, sending a formal letter asking if she could see the children under supervised conditions. The letter said she'd been in therapy herself, and claimed to understand now what Rachel and her son did to our family. She wanted a chance to rebuild trust with her grandchildren and with me, and she promised to respect whatever boundaries I set. Marshall called me after forwarding the letter, and said I should think carefully before responding because anger was valid. But the children did love their grandmother despite everything. I told him I'd think about it and then spent 2 weeks thinking about nothing else, weighing my hurt against my kids' need for family connections. Marshall advised me during our next meeting to consider limited contact, because cutting off the grandmother entirely might hurt the children more than it protected them. We talked through different options and settled on monthly supervised visits at a neutral location, maybe the library or a park, with strict boundaries about what topics were off limits. No discussion of my ex-husband's case, no mention of Rachel, no comments about my parenting or our living situation. Marshall would draft the agreement and my mother-in-law would have to sign it before any visit happened, acknowledging that one violation meant permanent loss of access. The first visit happened on a Saturday morning at the public library's community room, with Marshall present to supervise and me sitting in a chair by the door ready to end things if needed. My mother-in-law looked older than I remembered, her hair more gray and her face tired in a way that went beyond not sleeping well. She apologized to the children right away for not believing their mother when she said something was wrong, and her voice cracked when she told them she was sorry for making everything harder. Then she pulled out photo albums from when my husband was young, spreading them across the table and pointing out pictures of him at my son's age. My son's whole face changed when he saw his dad as a little boy, leaning forward to study the photos like they held answers to questions he hadn't known how to ask. I started physical therapy the following week to address the lingering effects of the poisoning, meeting with a specialist who reviewed all my medical records and toxicology reports. My kidneys were recovering but slowly, and the doctor warned me I'd probably have chronic fatigue for years, maybe permanently depending on how much damage the antifreeze caused before Daisy figured out what was happening. The physical therapy focused on rebuilding my stamina through careful exercise that wouldn't strain my healing organs, and the therapist said I was lucky Daisy was smart enough to keep recording, because another few months of poisoning would have destroyed my kidneys completely. I started painting the bedroom on a Saturday morning 6 months after the arrests, covering the walls where my husband used to sleep with a soft blue that made the room feel different. Daisy helped me move furniture and we threw out the old bedding, replacing everything with new sheets and pillows that nobody else had ever touched. The kitchen took longer because I replaced every mug, every plate, every container that Rachel might have used to poison me. My son asked why we needed all new dishes, and I told him we were making a fresh start, which was true enough without explaining the real reason. The security system installation happened on a Tuesday, and I made sure only I had the access codes this time. No shared passwords, no backup keys hidden under rocks, just me controlling who entered my house. The technician showed me how to check the cameras from my phone, and I immediately pulled up every angle, watching my empty driveway and locked doors from the parking lot at work. That first week I checked the cameras maybe 50 times a day, but eventually it dropped to 10, then 5, then only when I felt that old anxiety creeping back. The support group met every Thursday evening at a community center downtown, and I almost didn't go to the first meeting because admitting I was a poisoning survivor felt too real. 3 other women sat in the circle that night, each with stories that made my skin go cold because they were so similar to mine. One woman's husband had been putting rat poison in her vitamins for 8 months. Another had a boyfriend who mixed cleaning chemicals into her juice every morning. The third had been poisoned by her own mother who wanted custody of her children. We all had the same exhaustion, the same confusion when doctors said it was just stress, the same moment when we finally discovered the truth. Hearing them talk about their experiences made something loosen in my chest because I wasn't crazy or paranoid or the only person this had ever happened to. The group leader explained that domestic poisoning happens more often than anyone discusses because victims feel ashamed and perpetrators rely on that silence. After the meeting, one of the women gave me her phone number and told me to call anytime I needed to talk to someone who understood. I saved her contact information under Sarah Survivor and felt less alone than I had in months. Daisy came home from the school 3 weeks later with a permission slip for a criminal justice project, asking if she could use her recordings as an example of forensic evidence. She'd been talking with Amira and Devin about how technology helps solve crimes, and now she wanted to study criminal justice when she grew up. I read the permission slip twice, making sure the school understood the sensitive nature of the material and that Daisy's name would be kept private. The project guidelines said students could research real cases with family permission, and Daisy had already outlined her presentation about how hidden recordings can document emotional abuse. She showed me her notes about chain of evidence, authentication of recordings, and how technology creates accountability for people who think they won't get caught. Watching her turn something horrible into educational purpose made me proud and sad at the same time. I signed the permission slip and helped her organize the recordings into categories, though we both agreed to leave out the worst parts about the poisoning for a middle school presentation. My son asked about writing to his father during our next therapy session, his voice small and uncertain like he expected me to say no. The therapist explained that supervised letter exchange might help him process his feelings about what happened and understand that his father's choices weren't his fault. I agreed, but told the therapist I needed to read everything before it got sent, making sure my son wasn't being manipulated again or taking blame for adult problems. We spent that session talking about what he wanted to say, and the therapist helped him write a letter asking why his father did those things and whether he ever really loved us. My son's handwriting was careful and neat, each word written slowly like he was trying to get everything exactly right. I read it 3 times before putting it in an envelope, checking for anything that sounded like guilt or self-blame, but it was just honest questions from a confused kid. The therapist mailed it to the prison with instructions that any response had to go through her office first for review. The letter came back 2 weeks later, 3 pages of my husband's handwriting that the therapist read before showing me. She said it was surprisingly honest and didn't contain manipulation tactics, so I sat down with my son to read it together. My husband apologized for hurting everyone and admitted he made terrible choices that destroyed our family. He didn't blame me for working or say Rachel tricked him or make any excuses for the poisoning and affair. He told our son that none of this was his fault and that being angry was okay and healthy. The letter explained that he was in therapy learning why he made such bad decisions and that he hoped someday our son might forgive him, but he understood if that never happened. I watched my son read every word twice, his finger tracing the sentences like he was looking for hidden meanings. When he finished, he asked if people could really change, or if his father was just saying things to sound better. I told him I didn't know, but that actions mattered more than words, and we'd see what his father did over time. My mother-in-law showed up at our 6th monthly supervised visit with a handwritten letter, asking if I would read it when I got home. She looked different from she had at the beginning, her face less defensive and more tired in a way that suggested real work, instead of just time passing. The letter was 4 pages long, written on plain paper with words crossed out and rewritten like she'd struggled with what to say. She admitted she'd enabled her son's worst behaviors his whole life, making excuses when he hurt people and blaming everyone else for his problems. She apologized for not believing me when I said something was wrong, and for defending Rachel when the evidence was right in front of her. The letter said she'd been in therapy for 6 months, learning about boundaries and accountability, and she wanted a chance to rebuild trust with her grandchildren and with me. She promised to respect whatever boundaries I set, and never question my parenting or bring up her son's case again. Marshall called me after I forwarded him the letter, saying I should think carefully before responding because anger was valid. But the children did love their grandmother. We talked through different options and settled on unsupervised visits after 3 more months of supervised contact, with a written agreement that one boundary violation meant permanent loss of access. The first unsupervised visit happened on a Saturday morning 9 months after everything started, and I drove my mother-in-law and the kids to the park with instructions to call me immediately if anything felt wrong. She cried when I told her the visits could continue without supervision, promising she'd never let me down again and thanking me for giving her another chance. I watched them walk toward the playground equipment, my son running ahead while Daisy stayed closer to her grandmother. My phone stayed in my hand the entire 2 hours, checking it every few minutes even though no calls came through. When I picked them up, my mother-in-law thanked me again and asked if she could take them to lunch next time. I said maybe in a few months, and she nodded like she understood that trust had to be rebuilt slowly. Devin called me a year after everything happened, asking if Daisy's recordings could be used in a training seminar for CPS workers about recognizing parental alienation. He explained that the case had become an example of how technology helps document emotional abuse that usually happens in private. Daisy was in the room when he called, and she immediately said yes before I could even ask her opinion. She wanted to help train people who protect children, and Devin promised her name would be kept private while her recordings taught investigators what manipulation sounds like. The seminar happened 3 weeks later at a conference center downtown, and Daisy attended with permission to see how her evidence was used. She sat in the back row while Devin played clips of Rachel's voice talking about sending my son to boarding school and convincing my husband to get custody. The CPS workers took notes and asked questions about authentication and legal admissibility, and afterwards several of them thanked Daisy for her bravery in documenting what happened. The prison called on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at work, and the woman on the phone said Rachel had violated the no-contact order by trying to reach the children through another inmate's family. She'd convinced someone's relative to send a letter to my address with messages for Daisy and my son hidden inside a birthday card. The card never reached us because prison officials intercepted it during routine screening, but the attempt was enough to violate her restrictions. Marshall filed paperwork that same day to extend the restraining order through her entire sentence plus 10 years after release, and the judge approved it within a week. Rachel got additional charges for the violation and lost privileges at the prison, and Marshall said this would be on record if she ever tried to contact us again. I thanked him and then went home to tell Daisy what happened, and she just nodded like she'd expected Rachel to try something eventually. My son's teacher called me in for a conference at the end of the school year, and I walked into her classroom expecting bad news because that's what I'd gotten used to. Instead, she told me he was doing better than ever, making friends easily and participating in class discussions without the anxiety that used to make him cry. He'd joined the soccer team and scored 3 goals in the last game, and she said watching him laugh with his teammates was completely different from the worried child she'd seen at the beginning of the year. His grades had improved, his behavior was positive, and he seemed genuinely happy during school hours. She asked what had changed at home, and I told her we'd been through some family difficulties, but things were more stable now. Walking out of that conference, I felt something I hadn't felt in over a year, like maybe we were actually going to be okay, and all the fear and pain was leading somewhere better than where we'd been. Summer came, and the therapy office had better air conditioning than our house, which made the weekly sessions almost pleasant, despite the hard conversations we kept having about trust and boundaries. Daisy sat in the blue chair closest to the window, while my son sprawled on the floor with the fidget toys the therapist kept in a basket, and I watched them both exist in the same space without the tension that used to make every family moment feel like walking on broken glass. The therapist asked Daisy how she felt about her relationship with her brother now, and Daisy said they talk more than they used to, about real things instead of just surface stuff. My son added that Daisy taught him how to recognize when someone was trying to manipulate him, which was something he wished he'd known back when Rachel was still around. I told them both that family isn't just about sharing DNA or living in the same house. It's about people who protect each other and show up when things get hard, and the therapist nodded like I'd finally said something she'd been waiting months for me to understand. We left that session and got ice cream even though it was almost dinner time, and Daisy laughed at something her brother said about his soccer coach, and I realized we were actually okay now, not just surviving, but building something real. 2 years felt like both forever and no time at all when I looked back at where we'd been. Daisy's acceptance letter for the criminal justice program came on a Tuesday, and she screamed so loud that my son came running from his room thinking something was wrong. He'd scored the winning goal at his tournament the week before, and I'd been there in the stands watching him run across the field with his teammates chasing him, and the joy on his face had made me cry in a way that felt clean instead of broken. My promotion came with a corner office and a salary that finally reflected the work I'd been doing for years, and I could focus on my career now without the exhaustion dragging me down every single day. Friday nights meant pizza on the couch with whatever movie the kids picked, and our house felt safe in a way it never had before, like we'd scrubbed away all the poison Rachel and my ex-husband had left behind. Rachel was still in prison where she belonged, serving her 18 years, and my ex-husband's letters arrived every few months taking responsibility for what he'd done without making excuses. My mother-in-law had earned back supervised visits through consistent respect for every boundary I set, and sometimes I even believed she was genuinely trying to be better. The scars hadn't disappeared, and I still checked my food sometimes before eating it, and Daisy still recorded important conversations on her tablet, and my son still woke up crying about boarding school nightmares. But we were healing together instead of falling apart separately. Daisy asked me last week if I was proud of how we survived everything, and I told her I was proud of how we were living now, not just getting through each day but actually building something better than what we'd lost, something that was completely ours.